And apologize to those who might have been watching online. Apparently I was muted this whole time. So he's giving them some specific teachings. He's going to address some specific problems that these congregations have, both internal and external. But most importantly, he's going to issue warnings or encouragement for them to remain faithful. A couple of notes to keep in mind. Remember, as John saw this vision of Jesus at the end of chapter 1, he talks about the 7 lampstands being the 7 churches. In essence, what's going on is that they are equating this lampstand with the church. In other words, it's the light of the church. And in a similar way, we have the indwelling of the Spirit. So we are kind of a single entity, and then the lampstand and the church. And so this is important because when Jesus cautions them about him removing their lampstand, he is essentially saying he's not going to see them as his church anymore. Additionally, we need to remember that this is still a vision. This is still conceptualized. And so, for example, when he talks about being in the seat of where Satan's is, or that they are tolerating Jezebel, they're not necessarily literally allowing a woman named Jezebel, or if a woman named Jezebel was to walk into our congregation, we wouldn't be able to admit her. Not what he's talking about. Okay, remember, he's still talking in concepts here. All right, but that being said, as we turn our attention now to these 7 churches and their messages. The first one is to Ephesus. If I could have a volunteer read verses 1 through 7, please.
To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this: I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, that you cannot tolerate evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. And you have perseverance and have endured for my name's sake, and have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Therefore remember from where you have fallen, and repent and do the deeds you did at first. Or else I am coming to you, and will remove your lampstand out of its place, unless you repent. Yet this you do have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God.
All right. So by and large, Jesus has good things to say about Ephesus. Remember, at this point, they have become a center of strength for the church. By the time that the book of Revelation is written, and by the time this vision is received by John, in a lot of ways, Ephesus has displaced Jerusalem and even Antioch as kind of a hub for Christianity, as the church begins to shift away from the Israeli homeland, and really kind of shifts into the rest of the world, and especially into Europe. It's not, I guess, surprising that, again, these types of shifts would take place. At the same time, it's not that Antioch or Jerusalem suddenly just disappeared by any stretch of the imagination, but of course it's going to make sense for Christians who are much more European, who are especially maybe more Gentile, to look to places like Ephesus than it would be for them to look to Jerusalem for support and for an example, I guess. And so he says that he is happy with their perseverance and their toiling, their intolerance for evil men, and their testing of the saints. And these are all great things. And at the same time, we cannot ignore the connections that we've seen in John's other writings. And from a historical standpoint, remember that at the close of John's life, he was living and working in Ephesus and the surrounding area. And I can't help but personally see a callback here to John's writings, specifically his letters, right? Where he tells the churches to test the spirits and to see which ones are true. And here he makes specific mention of them doing that and him being proud of them for doing that, if you will. And so, it could very well be that this is God, this is John making use of that connection that they had between the writer and this congregation. We also can look at the book of Acts and we can see that from really its inception, the church at Ephesus has had struggles. Not necessarily the type of struggles that we're looking at, for example, in the book of 1 Corinthians. It's not as much internal struggles as it is that they've been persecuted, right? The silversmiths wanted to try to run Paul and the others out of town because they were afraid of the damage that it was doing to their work. And all of these types of things that go into our understanding of some of the things that John is talking about. And I say only some because, of course, this is roughly 40 years or so removed from the book of Acts as far as when those events took place. Maybe even longer, depending on your dating of those events. And so a lot can happen in 40 years, right? As far as, I really don't think that necessarily the church in Ephesus is still having a daily battle against the silversmiths, right? Those types of things. But Jesus here wants them to understand that he sees that they are still embattled. They are still struggling. And that in itself should be an encouragement, right? That God is aware of the things that his church is going through. He is aware of the things that we are dealing with. And we're going to see that unfortunately, for several of these congregations, God being aware of what they're doing isn't always going to be positive for them, right? But there's still that reminder, and we have to be careful that we don't think of God keeping an eye on us as him, micromanaging our lives or something like that. That's not it at all. He's noticing that they are doing good things. They have perseverance, and I love that word perseverance. It does not mean to just maintain. He talks. Other versions might use the word steadfastness. They're not perfectly synonymous, but they're similar from a biblical context, anyways. Not as much in our English usage, but in these things, they are not just maintaining. They are not just continuing on. They're not trudging, right? When you think of the word trudge, you think, okay, there's no moving, but is there anything happy about trudging? Does the word trudging, does that bring up positive things, right? I mean, how many of you would wake up every Monday morning and say, all right, I get to trudge through another 8 hours at work? You have to trudge through every 8 hours at work. You might need to find a different work. Just, throwing things out there for you. This isn't simply I'm shouldering this burden and I'm maintaining upright. When he talks about being steadfast, when he talks about their perseverance, he's talking about them growing. He's talking about them thriving despite the hardships. Okay? in spite of everything that the world, everything that maybe these outside forces are trying to do to bring the congregation in Ephesus down, they are staying faithful, and there's growth. It may not be numerical growth, okay? We have to understand that. When we talk about church growth, we should not immediately jump to the numbers of people present. Church growth happens in a lot of different ways. Yes, there's numeric growth, but there's also strengthening and those types of things that has to happen in order to support the numerical growth, right? Let's just consider something here from a congregational standpoint. When we think about church leadership, what's the minimum number of elders for a congregation? 2. Has to be a plural, has to be multiple elders. That's all that the Bible tells us. So has to be 2, all right? So let's assume a congregation has 2 elders. In your personal experience, what's the average size of a congregation that has an eldership? I would say somewhere between 50 and 100, usually. Much lower than 50. It's not impossible, but your pool is going to be very, very small to draw from, and it's going to definitely be not necessarily the norm, right, of potential candidates. Okay, so let's even go with the lower end, and let's say 50. What's your leadership to congregant ratio with 2 elders in a congregation of 50? 1 to 25, which is also one of the reasons that deacons are important. Okay? So if we think of church leadership, think of it as an upside down triangle. Okay, so if your congregation is only growing numerically, but it's not growing strength-wise, if your congregation is growing in people, but it's not growing in leadership, what is going to happen to your upside-down triangle? It's going to tip over or collapse altogether, right? And so when we talk about the perseverance of the Church of Ephesus, we shouldn't necessarily assume that John or Jesus is talking entirely about numbers. There's a lot of other ways that churches have to grow. And it tends to kind of go in waves or in circles, right? Where maybe you do grow numerically, and then maybe the numerical growth kind of stalls, and that's where you start to begin this period of spiritual and leadership growth. And then once that's in place, and again, once you build out that base of leadership, you're ready for numerical growth. And if you don't think about these things ahead of time, by the way, that's when churches collapse. When there's not solid leadership, in whatever form that it takes, you can't support the numerical growth. And then remain what we see in verse 2 here of Revelation chapter 2. It's not going to remain doing good deeds. It's not going to remain standing for the truth. It's not going to remain able to test the saints. It's not going to remain able to endure the things that it needs to endure, because you're not going to have a stable foundation for those things to happen. And so he's talking about all of these things, and it's not just that they're maintaining, but even as he says at the close of verse 3, they have endured and not grown weary. He's not just talking about the fact that, okay, I think about, because it's that time of year, right, hurricanes and things, I always think about, why do they make those poor weathermen and women go stand out in the wind and the rain? Right? You ever see that? Right? Where they 80-mile-an-hour winds, and you got some guy out there in an overcoat with a microphone trying to hold an umbrella. Like, we know it's windy. Right? It's not about just standing there in the storm and taking it. Because you're going to get pretty weary of that, right? I mean, how many of you want to go stand out in a hurricane for hours at a time? Nobody does. That's not what he's talking about here when he talks about their perseverance and when he talks about their not growing weary. They have a safe place, right? They're weathering this storm, but they're doing so in a way that allows them to come out of those difficulties with speed, with energy, right? And sometimes that's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to go to ground. You have to go into the storm shelter, right? Sometimes you have to wait for something to pass. You have to, kind of huddle up. Okay, we're going to get through this. Okay, we did this. We didn't stop, but we have to kind of circle the wagons a little bit, and then once the threat is over, okay, now we can come out and we can get right back to what we were doing because we made sure that we were in a good place for that time, right? Christianity should not be something that seems burdensome. It should not be something that leaves you ragged. Okay, even when we're having to deal with difficult things, whether those difficulties are in the form of false teachers, which seems to be something that Ephesus was dealing with, right? Because they're having to test the saints, or something else. Then he says in verse 5, not everything's perfect, right? Verse 4, he says they've left their first love. Well, okay, this, by the way, is a theme. They've left their first love. Well, what does he mean by that they've left their first love? Remember where you have fallen and repent. Do the deeds you did at first. He's not talking about their relationships in a physical sense. He's not talking about the fact that divorce was running rampant in Ephesus. What he's talking about when he talks about them losing or walking away from their first love, he's talking about their devotion to Jesus. It might be that what was going on in Ephesus is that because of the storms, their Christianity had become mechanical. And this is something that can happen, right? Sometimes we can get so focused on everything that's going on, we get kind of trapped in survival mode. I'm sorry? Trapped in traditions. But we can just kind of, that fight or flight reflex, and maybe we're just stuck in flight. Right? We're stuck in this mode where it seems like we're struggling, right? They've got this, they've got these outside forces that are trying to affect them, and maybe they've become overly focused on that. Have you ever known somebody or a Christian or a congregation that's overly focused on issues? Is that a lot of fun to be around? Does that really, promote what Jesus is all about when all those people ever seem to think about is the current issue of the day? No, because Jesus and everything is a whole lot bigger than what's happening right now, right? It's not that we ignore those issues. It's not that we ignore, potential false teachings or anything like that, but we've got to understand that whatever troubles that we're experiencing right now are just that. They're troubles that we're experiencing right now. And God is way bigger than that. And the gospel is way bigger than that. And too often what happens is that when we start dealing with issues, and by the way, these issues, they come up over and over and over again. Okay? Let's not think that some of the social issues that we are dealing with or that seem to be hot topics right now, that it's the first time that it's ever come up. Okay? The church has always been concerned about the sexual nature of society, right? The Bible talks about lasciviousness. That means that very thing. Guess what? Okay, they didn't have TV ads. They didn't have home computers, but there were still a lot of things going on in ancient cultures that made people's minds think about things that they shouldn't be thinking about. We're looking at the issue maybe from our context of, these types of things. And don't get me wrong, we need to be concerned about those things. We need to have tools in place to help protect our kids. We need to have ways to protect ourselves from some of these influences, even if that simply means turning it off. Okay? But let's not think we're the only people in history that have ever had to deal with a society that was obsessed with these types of things. They've all been that way. And so we have to be careful that we don't get so obsessed with issues that we forget that there's something larger going on, right? And if you're dealing with something, by all means, that can be something that dominates your life, right? If you're dealing with addiction, or if you're dealing with a marital issue, or if you're dealing with kids having a problem, that will absolutely dominate your focus. And to an extent, that's the right thing to do. But at the same time, think about what has to happen, because is every single day, let's say you do have a child that is having some issues, or let's say that you are dealing with an addiction. If all you ever think about all day long is that problem, are you probably actually doing anything? Aside from wearing yourself out? Now, don't get me wrong, it's always in the back of your mind. But what we've got to get ourselves in this place of is, I'm going to either actively do something about this situation, and sometimes that's going to take all of my energy in a moment of weakness, right? When you're facing addiction and that urge comes up, it might take everything you've got to fight that urge. But you also have to have other focuses, right? You also have to train your brain to start thinking about other things and to be working towards other things, because if not, if you just let that issue dominate every moment that you're awake, you're going to collapse. And so will a church. And so when we go back to our first love, we go back to a love of the gospel. We go back to a love of Christ saving people from their sins. We go back to something that is so much bigger than any of our issues. And it also helps to bring that sense of peace and calming, because there's hope, right? There's something bigger than these issues. There's something bigger than all of this. And of course, the book of Revelation is written to help give us perspective on these very things. And he's doing so here in a very personal manner with Ephesus and these other 6 churches that we will eventually talk about. But the real warning in verse 5 is that when we become overly focused on things that aren't the work of the church, that aren't the gospel, that aren't about helping people to find their way to Jesus, what's the warning? He's going to pull the lampstand. A church that no longer focuses on what a church is supposed to focus on will cease being a church. You can put whatever you want on the building. You can put whatever you want on a sign out front. A church that's not doing the work of the church is not a church. It's a social club focused on whatever it is that it's actually focused on, because it's not focused on the work of the church. That's Jesus' warning. Be my church or you won't be my church. By the way, you could go back in church history and verse 4, the leaving their first love, the root of every problem the church has ever experienced. Being focused on things besides what the church is supposed to be focused on has brought about every single problem that the church has faced since it began on the day of Pentecost. Because see, when we try to fix a problem that never existed because we stopped paying attention to what God wants us to do, we make more problems. It's that simple. And then he gets to verse 6. He calls for them to repent, and he's already praised them for standing against false teaching, but then he says in verse 6, that they hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Now, the Nicolaitans are going to be mentioned a couple of times here. I'll just be honest with you, we don't have a spectacular idea of what this is. I say it in that way because it's not that we have no idea. For example, you might have picked up that this is being run or attributed to somebody named Nicholas. Okay, right? In the same way that a Christian is somebody who follows Christ, a Nicolaitan is somebody who follows Nicholas. There were a few Nicholases about this time, and there were some false teachings going on, and there were some groups, because there's always been these groups, right? What we don't really have a super great idea on, because it just really isn't talked about in, for example, some of those early church writers that we often look to, there's not really I guess a really great definition of what it was that they taught, or what it was that they believed, or what it was that they were pushing. But to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter. Okay? I just want to be open with you guys that you can probably pick up a few different commentaries on the book of Revelation, and they're probably going to tell you that the Nicolaitans taught this, that, or the other, and it's probably not always going to line up because we don't have a lot of source material. What is important is that they're standing against it. So whatever it wasn't right. And that's really the important thing. Even as he says that they've been testing those that call themselves apostles and found them to be false, it seems that maybe there was a connection there, that maybe Nicholas or maybe some of his followers were claiming apostolic authority or powers of the apostles. It's kind of hard to disconnect verse 2 from verse 6, right? Especially since he's talking to the same group of people here. We just don't know definitively exactly what they taught, but as long as it wasn't as long as it wasn't the truth, then that's all that matters. Anything that's not the truth is not right, it's not acceptable. And he praises them for this. So, even though we have in verses 4 and 5, we have this challenge, this hey, this needs to get fixed right away, Jesus still comes back and he praises them. Look, you are doing good things. And then we have in verse 7, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. What a beautiful sentiment, right? All right, so as we look at this, and we took a lot of time with Ephesus because it's the first of these letters, it's kind of sets the stage. And so let's take just a minute, and we're going to see something here, a pattern really that's going to develop, not exclusively and not entirely, but a general pattern that we're going to see for the rest of these letters as well. Okay? And that is, he's going to be writing to the angel. Remember, he's got the stars and the angel and the lampstands, okay? He's going to be writing to this church. He's going to generally introduce himself in some way. And so, for example, here to the church in Ephesus, he is the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and the one who walks amongst the 7 lampstands. To Smyrna, he is the first and the last who was dead and has come to life. And so Jesus' introduction of himself, his description of himself in each of these letters, is also important to understanding what he's trying to get across. To Ephesus, he wants to emphasize that he sees what they're doing. He's walking amongst his lampstands. He's walking amongst his churches. He has the power of the angels in his right hand, right? So we have this introduction of Jesus. He's going to talk about their deeds, good, bad, and other. And then he's going to issue them this challenge to hear, to pay attention, and he's going to generally issue a promise. Here it is the promise of eating of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Now I want you to think about this. When else do we hear of the tree of life? When I say the tree of life, what major biblical event jumps to your mind? Adam and Eve, right? That's the last time that humanity has had access to the tree of life. It's been a while, right? And it was sin that cut us off from it in the first place, and it's still sin that has kept us from it. And here he's promising access again. So even here to Ephesus, a church that he challenges that they need to repent, they're still having some issues in their work. There's still this promise that there's still hope, right? Okay, yes, you need to fix some things, but if you fix them, if you repent, if you come around and you do what you need to do, you'll have access to the tree of life. You'll have access to everlasting life. Which is in the paradise of God. I love that description. Heaven is paradise. Now, what you think of as paradise and what I think of as paradise might have slightly different ideas, right? I've heard it described that there are, for example, mountain people and beach people. So maybe your idea of paradise is a white sand beach, the sound of the waves, and it's like a perfect 73 degrees, right? The sun's not too hot, and you can just enjoy paradise. Or maybe your paradise is a mountain meadow, a babbling brook, a waterfall in the distance, trees and the smell of pine. Paradise. And I don't know, maybe heaven is going to be slightly different for all of us, or maybe there'll be places we can go to experience our own version of paradise. Whatever it is, God will be there, so we'll be okay, right? But whatever your absolute best picture in your mind of whatever paradise could be, I promise you it's nothing compared to the actual thing. And that's really one of the key messages to this book as a whole, as we're going to continue to look into these things, is it's about God trying to remove all of those things that we worry about and help us to focus on what we need to worry about. Is death a concern for most people? Yeah, right? I mean, we have seatbelts and airbags. We've got hard hats and neck braces. We've got, hospitals and nursing homes. We have vaccines and antibiotics, right? Why? Because there's stuff that can kill us, and so we try to protect ourselves from it, right? And those are just like everyday things when we talk about our fear of death, right? Here he's promising access to the tree of life. Which, by the way, if you're not maybe quickly remembering, one of the reasons Adam and Eve had to get cast out of the garden is that God said they can't have access to the tree of life because they'd live forever. So when he's giving us back access to the tree of life, he's promising that we'll live forever. The fear of death is gone. One of the things that we as a society, we as a world culture, we as humanity have spent countless hours, billions upon billions, trillions upon trillions of dollars on is fighting death. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm much happier to be able to have a life expectancy that's closer to 80 than I am 40. Right? Like it used to be. But it's still a concern that we will not have in heaven. And we can't even conceptualize that. I honestly don't think we can. Because what are the only two things that we can be sure of in life? Death and taxes. And which one leads the list? Death. Right? Well, taxes. Right? We have absolutely no way to frame a mindset to not think about death. And I don't even mean our current society's seeming preoccupation with it when it comes to things like news and other things. Okay, because people have been dying and killing each other, well, since Cain and Abel, right? We just have no idea what it is to truly live without a fear of death. And that's one of the things that I'm excited about and I'm in awe of, is a life where that's never in the back of my mind. All right, and so that's the letter to the church of Ephesus. We may not take an entire class for each of these 7 letters, but we might. There's a lot of good stuff here, and remember, this is part of the section when we looked at at chapter 1, verse 19. Write the things which you've seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. We're in the things that are. John and Jesus here are focused on these are real issues for real people in real places, and he's addressing it. He's saying, look, okay, Ephesus, look, Smyrna, look, Pergamum, Thyatira, and so on. I know that you're going through some things. And then he's going to open up this book and say, okay, you're going through all of that, but don't forget all of this. And he doesn't do that to scare them. He does it to give them confidence. He does it because he wants them who has an ear to hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And that's important for us to keep in context. Remember, his whole point in writing these letters, his whole point in writing this book is to get them to be better Christians, even though maybe there's some big scary things on the horizon. The book of Revelation is not a book to be scared of. It's not a book that should bring fear because it's not a book about fear. It's a book about living without fear. Some of it we're going to have to wait for. Which is why John ends this book saying, Lord, come quickly. Because if we truly want that, right? If we truly want a life without the fear of death, if we truly want a life where we live in the victory of Jesus, then we have to, with John, pray, Lord, come quickly. Food for thought as we continue our study over the next few weeks, several weeks. Let's be real. All right. Thanks, everybody. We're going to go ahead and end class a minute early. I know, shocking. Don't fall out of your pews. It may, probably not, happen again. All right. Thank you.